We welcome you, sir, and thank you for joining. And we look forward to listening to your lecture, sir. So I hand over the session to you, sir.
Thank you so much. Can you see the PPT?
Sir, it's opening up. I can see your laptop, the screen, but
But it has not yet opened, no?
yes. It is open now. Yes.
It's open. Okay. So, good morning, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be with you again. And today, as Pratyusha has already announced, I will be talking about partition studies from the point of view of methods and methodology. And I will try to keep 10 to 15 minutes at least for discussion. And if it is possible, you can come online, a visual as well. I'm not very sure whether that is possible. But during the question answer session, it becomes interesting when you can see each other. When that I don't know whether that is possible, but I think we can talk about that later. But right now, I will go back to my last lecture and remind you that I talked about the differences between three concepts. Number one, research skills. Number two, research method. And number three, research methodology. And I said, following Gabriel Griffin, that research skill is obviously some kind of skill that you are required to perform during your research tenure. For example, as I said, projecting this PPT is one such kind of skill, and there are other kinds of skills. For example, bibliography is one such skill, and there are many other skills that you can think of. Method is the way you conduct your research, for example, through archives, for example, through textual analysis method, through interviews, through several such methods, several other methods as well. Visual method, for example. And methodology is basically for us who are working from within the periphery of literature departments. By methodology, we basically mean the theoretical framework, the critical framework, the framework that helps us integrate the images that we get while reading a text. It may be different kind of text, for example, visual text or print text, whatever kind of text it may be. So methodology actually helps us integrating the components. Someone is saying something?
No, sir, it was accidentally like the person unmuted.
Okay.
Yeah. Participants are please requested to mute yourself because it disturbs the lecture. It's a request, please. Yeah.
Okay. So these are the three types of concepts that I talked about last time. And today I will draw upon these concepts, basically methods and methodology. These will be underlying my lecture. This you will find when I say something, that kind of presentation, that kind of comments and observations will be informed by these concepts, basically the concepts of method and methodology. Now, today's focus will be the partition of India and its representation. And you will note with interest that the word representation is something which is ideologically mediated. So don't forget that whatever kind of representation we make, whether it is through some speech, whether it is through some painting or literary text, poem, novel, short story, drama, or through visual medium, for example, a film, all these are basically mediated by some kind of ideology. So ideology is something that informs all our representation. The partition of India, which was a cataclysmic event, and this was an event within quote, and I will come to the concept of even later on, but it was an event that made severe changes, that brought about severe changes, not only in the geopolitical situation of our continent, but it also brought new consciousness, a kind of consciousness that made us look at the event from different perspectives. Pakistanis will not look at the partition in the same way the Indians or the Bangladeshis will look at it. So you see, partition of India was an event which brought about large-scale changes, and this event had been represented through different media in different ways, and I shall today discuss some of the approaches, methods, and methodologies through which we can obviously look at the event of the partition of India that took place in 1947. So please keep that representation is not a very innocent kind of term. It is informed by some kind of ideology, and ideology, as you know, is also informed in its own turn by the locales, by the status of the person, by the ethnicity, religion, religious background, etc. So from all these points of view, we will look at the event of the partition of India. The partition of India, since you have come from different disciplines, I will keep history in mind, but I shall also basically foreground literary representations, and I might sometimes talk about filmic representations as well. You know that Fazila Yakubalai Zamindar is a historian, but historian with a difference, and she wrote a very interesting book, that the title of which is The Long Partition and the Making of Modern South Asia. Refugees, Boundaries, Histories. This was published in 2007. Obviously, you can see that the book was published some 14 years back. It was not that it was published in the earlier century. With the progress of time, our attitudes to an event changes. And therefore, you see, when something is written in 2020 or 2015, 2010, or 2000 itself, or 1995, you will find that something which was written in 1995 is not exactly the same that we read in 2000, a book that was published in 2000. I mean that our approach to the event changes, obviously informed by new kind of consciousness. and we used different methods and methodologies. For example, in the earlier part of the partition studies in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, mainly 1950s and 1960s, the historical approach was basically based on the state archives, and it heavily depended on the information, the government information, the information that the governments actually offered, and the papers that are archived in the government archives. All these were important for the historians to consult, and they consulted those things and wrote their history books. So the history of the partition written during the 1950s or 60s or 70s was basically very conventional in nature. And the method was obviously very conservative, depended as they were on the state archives or the information that the government of India, the government of Pakistan, they offered. So that changed when in the 1980s and in the 1990s, oral literature, oral history methods and methodology became very much visible, and those methodologies changed the complexion of our gaze at the partition of India. So we no longer looked in the same way from the point of view of the government or from the perspective of the government materials, the perspectives that helped us, that was formed because of our reading of the government materials. And this was 1980s was the time when we went beyond the conventional methods and methodologies and tried to look at other sources. What were the other sources? The other sources were the common people. The other sources were the people of India, the common people of Pakistan, common people of the eastern part of India, the northeast, common people who are residing in what we know as Bangladesh today. Bangladesh was created in 1971. And obviously, the people of Bangladesh didn't look at partitions the same way as the Pakistanis do or did. Although it was part of Pakistan at one time until 1971, from 1947 to 1971. So the historical situatedness, which is not static, always influence our gazes at a particular event. And please remember that history is not static. Even the boundaries of the states are not static, which is obviously borne by the fact of the history of the Indian subcontinent. India was one at one time, and it had a particular kinds of boundaries, very specific kinds of boundaries. And in 1947, it changed and became two countries with two different kinds of boundaries. India had one kind of boundary, and on its two wings, on two different sides, east and west, there was Pakistan, and Pakistan in its two forms, West Pakistan and East Pakistan. And the boundary changed further in 1971 when East Pakistan became a sovereign state, having its own boundary, a new boundary. So the new state changed the entire complexion and defied the staticity of history. So we cannot see history from static points of view, and our representations of the history also changes with the changes in the gazes. Now, Zamindar's History, which was written in 2007, reflects this kind of new attitudes. When she wrote the book, she had 3 countries to study, and she believed that initially she thought, and she started her work in Pakistan, but ultimately she felt that she cannot do her work, complete her work with the materials available in just in Pakistan. So she had to consult materials which are available in India and Bangladesh, basically India. So writing the history of Pakistan, or writing the history of the partition or partition of India, necessarily requires that wherever we might be located, wherever we might be grounded, it may be in India, it may be in Pakistan, it may be in Bangladesh, or it may be in the diaspora, our attempts at locating our materials cannot be confined to one particular country. It embraces the entire subcontinent, and even going beyond the subcontinent to the archives that are present in England, for example, because England was the colonial master until 1947. And in its archives, there are many, many materials, letters, everything. So researchers obviously makes it mandatory that you go beyond your state boundary and investigate different kinds of materials, not just the materials available in state archives, but you go beyond that and find other kinds of archives. For example, the family archives. For example, you go to the people, the common people, you take interviews, conduct interviews, series of interviews, you survey, and then you can have lots of materials which were absent in the first generation of historical works written by the first post-generation historians. So generation matters. Generation of historians matter. Generation of literature writers, novelists, poets matter. Manto wrote in one way, but the people who are writing now, they look at partition in a different way altogether. For example, if you look at Amitabh Ghosh's representation of partition in the shadow lines, you will find that it is a kind of a representation which is looked at from the point of view of post-memory, because the young boy who is the narrator, and mind that he is there are 2 very important factors, and I will come to these factors later on if possible. Number 1, he is anonymous, he has not been given any name. And number 2, he is a young boy narrator. Similarly, if you look at Ice Candy Man, the narrator is very young, she is a girl, very young girl, and she has been given some name, but she, like the narrator, the anonymous narrator of Amitabh Ghosh's narrative, is very, very young. And if you look at, for example, Lilia's character, Lilia is a character in Jhumpa Lahiri's short story, When Mr. Pirzada Came to Dine. You will find that Lilia too is a very young narrator who is looking at partition from the point of view of post-memory. You know that post-memory is a concept that is well known because post-memory is something that happens beyond the personal memory. So you have, as a narrator, you have not suffered the memory firsthand. You are getting it from secondhand. You are getting it from the memory of your earlier generations, your parents, your grandparents, and things like that. So these young narrators are looking at partition from a different generational point of view, and this perspective obviously demands new kinds of methodology, and that new kinds of methodology requires something which is based on post-memory, theories of post-memory and other related memories. So trauma is not first-hand here. Trauma is handed down to the post-memory generation. So there are differences like that, and Zamindar and other historians and literary artists, they are trying to cope up with the history of partition, the memory of partition from a different point of view. So you know that the historians of the first generation, historians of partition, did not deal with the questions of memory, didn't deal with the concerns of the common people. They saw the population as one single mass, okay, with no variations there. They saw that such and as they give statistical data, such number of refugees came to India and such number of refugees went to Pakistan. Okay, how did they go? That was not much of a concern. How did they go? Did they go by trains? Were trains available? Did they walk on foot? Was walking on foot possible? Did they come to India from Pakistan or from Bangladesh on foot or by bullock carts or by sheep or aeroplane? These are the questions that these historians did not concern. The first generation of historians of partition didn't. To them, these were not important questions, but these were important questions for the later generations of historians and later generations of literary artists. You know that train became a very potent symbol in literature. Okay, train to Pakistan, for example, or in Ice Candyman, you also get to know how trains come and how trains became ghost trains and how bodies, thousands of bodies, especially bodies of women, lay scattered in the train compartments. And you also will find descriptions of the train, bogies of trains in Bapsi Sidhwa's other books, which other books, I forget the names of the book, but I will remember and tell you. And there is also this description of the train in Difficult Daughters, for example. So you will find descriptions of train in many literature books, in novels, in short stories. Manju Kapoor wrote that book, Difficult Daughters, you know that. So because, as you know, they investigated history, but they did not, these literary artists investigated the history from different methodological points of view, different historiographical points of view. You know that historiography is the, actually means the principles or the methodologies on which history is built up. history is constructed. History is also a kind of construction, a kind of representation. It depends heavily on the mindset and the ideological position of the historians. And therefore, you see, history is also a kind of representation, and historiography is obviously different when a new generation of historian constructs the history of partition, or for that matter, any other history. So you see that these are important questions, and historians and literary artists, they go beyond the state archives in order to construct new kinds of histories. Okay. Zamindar, whom I have mentioned, for example, concentrated heavily on the plights of the citizens and stateless persons. There are two very important points. Number one, she says that the partition is a long partition, by which she meant that the partition did not end in 1947. The echoes and the reverberations of partitions went on for a long time. And she collected case studies of people who were stuck up in Pakistan or who were stuck up in India, Indians who were stuck up in Pakistan, Pakistanis who were stuck up in India, and how they were not allowed to move to India or Pakistan, their desired country, and they remained stateless persons without a state in India and Pakistan for years together, for decades together. And there are a lot of cases like that in her book. And in newspaper reports of recent times, I've come across such reports of stateless persons stuck up in India and Pakistan in newspapers and in Facebook pages. There are several such instances. So this is something which is important, and this factor concentrates on the humanitarian points and the ethical points. And ethics is very much part of representation. And this ethical points of view are very much present in the historiography of Zamindar and the historians of the present age. So this is a very important position taken by Zamindar, and therefore he says it's a long partition. And a long partition actually revolves around the issue of citizenship. But now you can also take up this idea, and you can see that when we use the term long partition, we can apply it to another aspect of the partition. You know that the process of partition started not just in 1947. There was another partition, 1905 partition of Bengal, and that actually wanted to create seeds of differences between the Hindus and the Muslims. And ultimately, because of the actions, because of the protest movements in which iconic figures like Rabindranath Tagore also participated, you know that partition was called back, and it created a kind of both a sense of differences, but also a sense of unification between two Bengals. This very historical event was implemented in 1905, remains etched up in the memory of the people, in the ancestral memory of the common people, because that is a reminder of the fact that the differences within quotation marks, differences remain. And the differences should be celebrated, but instead of celebrating the differences, we often tend to highlight the difference and make enemies out of ourselves. That was a process which is very unethical, and this unethical dimension of the process was shown in 1905 partition, and which was pointed out by historians. Now, 1905 partition ultimately culminated in the 1947 partition, which was an irreversible process. Because it could not be called back. And I'm not going into the historical details. I'm not going into how many people were displaced and etc. The kind of trauma that was created. I will only try to look at, investigate, and later discuss with you the approaches and the methods and methodologies of the representation of partition, and as well as how we can, as students of literature, students of social sciences, humanities, how we can investigate, how we can do our own researches in our own institutions or from our own points of view. So you know that you need to consult, number one, all kinds of archives. By archives, I don't just mean the institutional archives, but the archives that are scattered everywhere. It may be located in somebody's family or some other places, in schools, colleges, or even the memories of the people. So the first point that I mentioned is that the archives of the three countries and going beyond the three countries is important. And in the same breath, I also suggested that we cannot investigate, we cannot research from one single point of view, from one's keeping in memory one static history. That is not possible. So the generational aspects of approaching the event should also be kept in mind. I will talk about generation a bit later, but I will just remind you that the present generation, most of you who are listening to my lecture, belong to a totally different generation. You are young researchers, you are very early career, either you are very early career research scholars or early career teachers in schools, in colleges and universities. So for you, the partition means something else. For you, you are very curious and you want to know partition because you have not seen partition with your own eyes. You have not encountered the trauma of partition. The memory of partitions had been handed over to you by the earlier generations, either by your family, your parents, grandparents, or by your neighbors and relatives. So generations matter. And generations, for example, matter because the first generation of partition who themselves suffered losses of lives, losses of friends and relatives, losses of near and dear ones, they look at partition in the way you will not like to look at the partition from that same point of view, because you don't have the memory of the losses, first-hand memory of the losses. And being born in a different time, you can have friendship with people who reside in Pakistan or Bangladesh, or Bangladeshis or Pakistanis who are located in the diaspora. And therefore, in the diaspora, friendship has really stuck up. The friendship has been struck, and they are doing fine in the US and the UK and other countries in Europe. And out of their collaborations, new kinds of researches are coming. So there is a certain kind of forgetfulness, deliberate and forced, in the first generation of research scholars and literary writers, historians. The forgetfulness of the amnesia may be forced, may not be forced, because as you know, if you can't remember, if you don't want to remember, please don't remember, because in that case, life would be easier. And that is a lesson that Urvashi Butalia found, came across while interviewing hundreds of refugees, displaced persons, women, because life will not go on. If you remember, your lives will be affected. But for the next generations, what happens is that opening up the amnesia with anamnesia will be very important. Anamnesia is remembering, recalling. So recalling is very important. What your parents could not recall, they didn't want to recall, didn't want to remember, the later generations wanted to remember, because they wanted to know what happened to their families, what happened to the people they know, the relatives and the friends. And in the process, they research the letters, they go into the letters written by their parents, friends, relatives, other people. They go to the people's houses, people's family archives, and excavate materials, letters, diaries. These are different kinds of materials which the new historians, they are digging up. And this digging up offers you new kinds of visions and approaching your representation. You bring all these things into your research works. So archives play, archival research, which is a new methodology and new method. Archiving is a new method. This archive has become very important for the research scholars, even in the departments of English and Bengali and Assamese and Manipuri and all other kinds of language studies and literature studies departments. And in this, they embrace an interdisciplinary approach, because survey is a method, or interview is a method usually adopted in social science departments. And literature students are also adopting this methodology. From that's this method, and therefore you see how the new researchers, PhD research, MPhil research, and other researchers are no longer confined to the textual analysis method, but also embracing other social science methods. Okay. And for methodology, they are embracing new kinds of theories like post-memory, like trauma studies, like intersectional studies, like memory studies. So these are new methodologies which are being explored by the new research scholars. Now, coming back to the mainstream historians, we have already said that how oral historians like Urvashi Butalia, Kamla Bhashin, and people like them, they became very active in the 1980s and late 1990s, and even later. And at the same time, there were a new breed of historians, a new breed of literary writers who involved themselves into researches in the family archive, and letters and diaries that are stored up in the families. And they went through the public archives as well. And by doing that, by researching into the family, they are researching into the partition. The personal and the family became the universal. So the approach was from the personal into the universal. This is a wonderful kind of an approach. You know the history firsthand, you discover the history firsthand from your own family heirloom, from the letters of your ancestors, and from the memory, from the ancestral memory, and you launch your research, you consult other people you know, you go to their houses, and you in the same breath, you do your own researches. The outcome is wonderful. So you become also citizen historians. And citizen historian is a concept which basically depends on the capability of the citizens, every citizens, common citizens, informed citizens, who can excavate new materials. Because as a historian, you cannot go to all the houses and you do not know all the people. And therefore, what is important for you is to take other people's help. You get into collaborative research, and many archives, 1947 archive, for example, which is a famous archive, and there is also a very important archive, such archive in Pakistan. And by taking help of these archives, you can employ citizen historians. And 1947 archive is really employing, they occasionally issue advertisement for recruiting the new citizen historians. And these people are initially trained and how to conduct interviews, for example, and then they are sent to different places, the people they know, and by doing that, they are excavating materials. And where do these materials go? They go to different archives, personal archives, the community archives, not only to the state archives. And in recent times, there has been visual archives, there has been archives through different websites, virtual archives, and anybody can go access those archives, and therefore the knowledge is opened up to the public. Knowledge no longer remains confined. Foucault has analyzed archive in an article, and the basic point in Foucault's article was that etymologically archives means something which is a government house. And this government house basically suggests that the entire control, the power is invested in the government or some powerful people. And these powerful people, it may be government officials, it may be ministers, it may be any other people who are in charge of the government archives. These people control the materials, they select the materials, they do not select the materials, they keep the materials, many materials which were collected outside the periphery of the archive, because according to their ideology, those materials do not fit into the archive. because they have a fixed idea of the archive. So from that point of view, you know that, just a minute please. অরিত্র আমি একটা ইয়েতে আছি, ওয়েবিনারে আছি, আমি তোমাকে কল ব্যাক করছি। So this is an archive which is important, because this is the sense of the archive that we usually confine ourselves to. But the new archives that I'm speaking of, the virtual archives, for example, these are open to everybody. So you can access the archives and you can write on your own. You have your own methodology and methods. And therefore, the concept of the archive is emancipated. And these are emancipated from the clutches of the powerful people, and they are distributed to the common people, amongst the common people. And this is something which oral history also does to a certain extent. They are published through books. So the concept of the citizen historians, the concept of the new archives, these are they offer new materials which help formation of the new historiography. They help formation of the new historiography of writing new novels. If you remember, if you think very deeply how Amitabh Ghosh might have written Shadow Lines, you will interestingly find that that the book was heavily dependent on archives. Why do I say these things? You try to remember. The boy narrator goes to the archive in Delhi and try to find out information about a riot that occurred because of the theft of the hair of an iconic figure in Kashmir, and that created riots in several places, including in Bengal and what is Bangladesh right now. But there was not a trace of that archive, that information in the state archive. So what the young boy narrator did is that he consulted the newspapers of the time, and he remembered that Budhi Kundaran scored a century in a cricket match against probably Australia. And he tagged that event, because he was a very young boy at that time. He tagged that century with the riot. So it coincided with the riots. And he actually searched Budhi Kundaran's, he found the Budhi Kundaran's date, date of the scoring a century. And he came across the report. And in the same newspaper, he found a small reference to the riots, very small reference, although it had huge effect on the life of the young boy and his family and his neighbors and the people of Bengal, because it triggered riots in many places, in Sylhet, in many other places, in East Bengal and in Kolkata, in Calcutta. It was Calcutta that time. So archive, as you know, do not accommodate articles, state archives do not accommodate articles which are not, in their opinion, required. So this concept of required is determined by the ideology of the person who are powerful, who control the state archives. This is a wonderful example. Moreover, as you know, the process in which the book is written, you can really find out how it is dependent on the methods and methodologies of ethnography, because he himself, Ghosh himself, was an ethnographer, and how Trideep, the main character there, is involved in archaeological study of one phase of Bengal history. So archaeology is the study which is concerned with digging up old materials. Similarly, Ghosh also tries to dig up old materials by exploring Thamma's memory and the memory of other people, and also through the state archives. So you know that how and in what ways, new ways, novel ways, archives may work in the making of a novel or in the making of a history. So mainstream historians and mainstream writers, Kriswan Singh, for example, did not take help of such archives because he belonged to a different generation. He had direct experience of partition. But Ghosh doesn't have direct experience of Pakistan, the experience of partition. So the methods become different, methodology becomes different. So historiography from that point of view is a very significant kind of idea and concept that you must mull over. One very important work, there are many such works, but one such work is Anam Zakaria's Footprints of Partition, Narrative of 4 Generations of Pakistanis and Indians. And you can have some idea of how generations are involved in the matter of partition study. Okay, here Anam Zakaria, in this book and in later books that she wrote, is heavily dependent on the interviews that she conducted, interviews with people who are located in India and Pakistan and in Bangladesh, and found that people's attitude to partition and to other communities are totally different from the attitudes that are portrayed in the the mainstream historians, as well as in the attitudes of the governments. The governments are not at all friendly, but the people are friendly. Many of them are friendly. They have gone to different persons, common people, and they remember the partition and they remember their friends, and they say and they feel how important those memories were. They want to go back to their old houses from which they were displaced, and they want to remember the people and inquire about that. And in the way the memory researches, and memory researches in a very friendly way, and many of them do not want to remember the violences, they want to remember the gestures of friendship. And these gestures of friendship, these materials of friendships are recorded in Anam Zakaria's book, as they have been recorded in many, many recent historians' book, and narratives of other kinds, like literary narratives. Kobita Punjabi's book, Kobita Punjabi's article, A Unique Grace, which is included in Urvashi Butalia's book Partition, The Long Shadow. It is also an article where you will find this, you will come across such instances of friendship. Kobita Punjabi accompanied one of her friends to Pakistan, who wanted to visit their ancestral house. And when They visited the house, knocked on the door. They found that after some moments when the inmate did not recognize the visitor, but when she recognized the visitor, there was exclamation of joy, and they were invited there like anything, and they were treated like friends. And Kavita Punjabi says that in the context of new time, this friendship is important. For the new generation, the friendship is important. So in many tales, you will find narratives of such friendship. These narratives you won't find in the first generation narratives, either literary or historical. I will come to these if I can, but I think I don't have much time. This is 11:01, I think, and I want to finish by 11:15 because my class is up to 11:30, is not it?
Yes, sir.
So please remind me at 11:15, okay? Some important partition archives, you may note down these. Just a minute, please. So hope you have actually taken down, noted down the names, and because the kinds of letters, kinds of old books published from unknown publishing houses, the kinds of materials, kinds of old books, memorabilia, and old letters. Everything has been, you will find different kind of images in these books, in these archives. These are new archives, these are not state archives. You will find in my institution, Netaji Subhash Open University, there is also a new archive, Bengal Partition Archive. And there are also, this is also a unique project which involves interviews of people who are above 70, people who had encountered partition firsthand, people who are located not in the cities, not in the urban areas, but in the remote areas, and particularly they are distributed in the border areas. And thirdly, they are people who are not even middle class. They are very poor, rural people, and working class people. What was their memory like? What were the things that they value very much? So these are the objects which have been collected and archived in Bengal Partition Project as well. Okay, so these are some of the three very important archives that I mentioned, and you can yourself access these. The new archival method have come a big way, and I believe that some of you who want to do research in partition studies will, or rather must, consult these archives. I will also just mention, because I think one and a half hour is not probably enough for speaking on, but we have to curtail whatever we want to say. And I am right now just projecting on one aspect, which is the archival method and the new historiography. I will just tell you about another book which is very important, and this is the book. Can you see this? Is it visible?
Well, yes, but there is the book, like, this is a slide which is written State Archive Phase 1. I think the next slide.
Okay, no. Okay, I see. This is not probably visible. Okay. So the book is written by Anchol Malhotra, Anchal. Please write down the name, writer, and the title of the book. This is a book written by Anchol Malhotra, Anchal, Malhotra, Malhotra. The book is called Remnants of a Partition. Remnants of a Separation. Remnants of a Separation. Its subtitle is A History of the Partition. A History of the Partition through Material Memory. This is a wonderful book, and I think you must consult the book. This book introduces the concept of material memory, which is a different kind of a concept. Material memory is that a memory that you can access through some particular material. You may be some jewelry, it may be the Quran, for example, the Ramayana, for example, or Tulsidas Ramayana, for example. It may be a book that your grandfather had liked, or your grandfather wanted to read. Anything like that, or the particular sari of a particular place. These are the items through which you can access your memory. These are the materials which trigger your memory and which trigger the memories of other people. And therefore, you see, you can really find access the partition of India through such memories. So here in this particular book, what Malhotra has done, Malhotra has taken interviews of some people, and they have also collected some material through which memory is accessed, memory of the partition. For example, there is a ghora for my father and a gauze for my mother, the heirlooms of somebody else. There is a chapter like this. There is the memory of a shoe, for example, the memory of a jewelry, for example, the memory of some diary, for example. So all these things are archived in the book as well, and Malhotra has also actually created a virtual archive. You can find that archive. So through these materials, different people who were interviewed, they access the memory of the partition. So material memory becomes one particular method through which you can really access the partition history. So from that point of view, this is a very important book, and I will want you to consult the book, to read the book, so that it takes help of the oral history method, and from that method, through that method, actually he collects the materials. I think I don't have much time. I want to react, actually interact with you for some time. So I will soon complete my lecture today. Here are two quotes. There is a quote here. Feminist scholars Urvashi Butalia, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin transformed the field and forced historians to confront the contradictions between nationalist encounters and partition narratives. Urvashi Butalia's book is The Other Side of Silence, Voices from the Partition of India. And Ritu Menon and Kamla Bhasin has written another book which is called Borders and Boundaries, Women in India's Partition. These are two important books which you should remember. So I don't want to say much right now. I will rather want you to interact, and in the course of interaction, I can say something more about what you want to know. So today what I have given you, talked about, is that history is being seen from a new standpoint. Literature is being written from a new standpoint. Literature is being seen from the point of view of oral history, from the point of view of feminist history, from the point of view of personal history, through the archival method, through the through trauma method, trauma histography. So all these are the new ways of seeing, and added to that, what has assumed importance, we have moved away from the mainstream historical method and methodology to new kinds of methods and methodology, which involve going to the archives, going to the people, taking interviews, taking surveys, and taking research to the people with the help of citizen historians. The world of literary representations have also changed as the partition of history is being seen from different personal locations, subject positions, for example, religious subject positions, identity point of view, from the point of view of Parsi writers, from the point of view of Christian writers, from the point of view of Hindus and the Muslims, from the points of view of Sindhis, for example. So different pockets are being, pockets of population, pockets of people are being explored for new materials and new kinds of representation. Memory has assumed a big role, and in achieving, in having access to the memory, because I use the word amnesia and anamnesia, the recent trend is that the new generations are looking at partition from a new point of view. They want friendship. They want to discover friendship in the peoples of the subcontinent. They want to approach partition not just as an event which raises nightmares, which triggers nightmares, generates nightmares, but also something that is a friendship that was lost but should be found again. And in that process, what has happened is that people, historians and literary writers, they go to the common people instead of the government materials. They are discovering new aspects of stories of the common people. And through such endeavors, a new historiography of both history writing and literature writing is being built up these days. I want to stop here, and if you have questions and you want to interact, because many of you are familiar with the event, many of you have ancestral memory of partition. So if you want to discuss this, I shall be very glad. Thank you very much.
Sir, thank you so much. We lost track of time. In fact, it seems that if time would have been it's not enough, as you said, but since we have to, so thank you so much, sir. There are lots of questions I can see. Let me read some of them. Sir, Linkhoi Gambi Devi, she asked, sir, please mention some research areas for literature students where they can adopt archival methods.
One important area may be look at the history of your own family, and if you are not associated with partition in some way, you can go to people who have history or who have written history. There are, for example, many books written in local languages, Bengali, for example, which project new kinds of experiences. Because the Northeast had a different kinds of experiences. Sylhet was part of India at one time, but Sylhet, there was a referendum there. And that created a new kind of dimension of the partition. And on the basis of those many literature, I know some books which were written in Bengali by people who are located in Silchar, for example, and they are writing about their own experiences. So there are many books like that which you can investigate, which you can write about, which you can take up for your researches. There are new works coming up. For example, the book that I said, Remnants of Separation, there are books like this, and there are many literary works in regional languages and in English as well, which are coming up, which are being published. So you can pick up those books, the literature people, and obviously write those books from new angles. Okay, you can take Parsi narratives, you can take up Sindhi narratives, you can take up narratives written by Muslims. Actually, narratives written by Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs. These form the mainstream of the partition narratives. But new books are also coming up. So these new books, you will have to do a search of what new books are coming up. And I know I've come across many books, I can't remember, because during the last 2 or 3 years, there must have been some 5, 6 new books written in English. So please search those books, read those books, and these books might be your primary resources for works. But please adapt new methodologies that I mentioned. For example, archival materials. What archival materials you can have. Okay, I have already mentioned 3 archives. You can find many other archives as well. State archives and non-state archives, private archives. So through this way, you can obviously have a very good research works. Next question.
She further writes, I think you answered already, but still, suppose an English literature student wants to research on one's local issues, but material are available in local dialect. In this case, what should he do?
Actually, in many departments, English departments, you are allowed to do researches in local languages as well. Okay, but you have to translate those parts which are important for you, relevant for you. You will have to translate that, or you will take help of translations if there are translations. If there are no translations, then you can translate the books, local materials yourselves, and then do your works. These are some of the ways in which the works can be done.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Now I call upon Dr. Champak Bhorali to summarize and conclude sir's lecture.
Thank you, Patricia, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Good morning. Yes, sir. There are some problem in my network.
Okay. Okay.
So just excuse me for that. Sir, Lahiri, sir. Good morning.
Good morning.
And right now, what summary I can find from your presentation, that it is a good suggestion that you are suggesting us to have a new, approach of new historian. Am I right, sir?
Yes, yes.
And you have suggested us to go for the archive, not only which are preserved officially. Okay, sir, it is a very wonderful, actually informative session. And you have already suggested us that you go among the common people, but not on which are confined in the historical boundary. Suppose if I am to study the partition history, or someone has to study the partition history, he or she should go to the beyond the historical geographical boundary. Suppose for Pakistan or Bangladesh or that is India. And so far I know learned from your lecture that history is not static. It is beyond boundary. Yes, sir. So writing history of India, Pakistan or Bangladesh, our attempt should not be confined to a particular country or particular research. So you have mentioned about the Amitav Ghosh writings, and similarly you have at the same time you have mentioned about Khushwant Singh's writing, which are quite different, because Khushwant Singh, he has written the things, their methodology are quite different, because to some extent Khushwant Singh has the fresh memory in his mind, or to some extent eyewitness, which could have which he has mentioned. And similarly Amitav Ghosh has mentioned in a totally different method. And post-memory concept is a well-known concept which is beyond memory of a personality. Am I right, sir?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
And yes, you have mentioned about the history of the first generation. They did not deal with the memory of the common people. Rather, they concentrate on presenting the statistical data. Yes, sir. And you have mentioned about that train, which became a potential symbol, and which creates sympathize, which creates a sort of sympathy towards the people, those who migrated from Pakistan to India, or some of them migrated from India to Pakistan. These are also can be a memory or incident which helps us to study partition. Earlier it was the days of train. Now it is the days of aeroplane, which we can see in Afghanistan, and people which fall down from there and died. Actually, it is really a pathetic story. And you have mentioned about to study about the history, humanitarian point also, ethical point also, while studying the history. And finally, you have mentioned that all kinds of archive, not only institutional, we should go to the archive which are preserved in the family, which are preserved in the community, and which are preserved even in with some person. And if possible, to study history, we should create or we should make friendship with the people of that particular region through Facebook or through email. And I am thankful to you, to sir, for giving the informations about the book, that Malhotra's book, Remnants of Separation. That is the history of the subtitle is the history of the partition through material memory. And I think it can be named also a study of history through material culture, I think, sir. Study of material culture. And finally, I would like to conclude here that you have suggested us to see history from a different perspective, because history not only in a written form, oral history, personal history, trauma history, feminist studies, material studies, all this can give us a new dimension, and which you like to call as a new historians. Am I right, sir? Yes. Thank you, sir, for giving us a new dimension of the study of the history. Because people, especially of our generation, whenever we say about history, just we try to go for the secondary materials. And from actually, this presentation is like an eye opener, that it has opened us to and instructed us to go to a different dimensions which are preserved among the people. And thank you very much, sir, for this nice presentation.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Bharali, for beautifully summing up the lecture. So, just my own, like I was thinking, like when you were talking about memory in terms of generations, you were talking about post memory. So when we go to seek materials or seek information to people who are much older, so there is also this question of forgetting, isn't it? Like when we talk about memory, there is also this element of forgetting. So how authentic is the information when we, because sometimes people, they have fuzzy memories, or they sometimes, the time and the space becomes like blurred. So how authentic then how reliable is the information? That is what I was thinking.
Actually, this is a question that has been asked several times, and that this is one of the complaints against oral history. Okay, this is it regularly crops up. Okay, so what happens is that oral history is something which is a kind of informal history. So, but you as a historian, if you are a literary artist, there is no problem. You can have your own ideas and you can reformulate the problems that you are facing. But if you are a historian, and a historian is supposed to be an objective observer, an objective investigator, and the findings must be properly written. So what happens is that you approach these as something where there might be fuzzy boundaries. Okay, because a man, even if he does not forget, can even lie. So there are possibilities of lying. There are possibilities of forgetfulness. So there are several kinds of things like that. But I'm not sure how the historians actually manage these things. But one thing I can say is that you re-evaluate the information in the light of the existing materials and history that is accessible to you, especially for the historians who depend on memory. Actually evaluate the memory. Not only they don't take the memories as it is, they also do further kinds of investigations. For example, they might investigate some other members of the same family, or his friends, the person who has been interviewed, his friends and relatives of the same age, for example, who might remember those things. So by doing that, some kind of conclusions he or she might arrive at. This might be one way, but I'm not very sure about how the historians tackle this question. But I don't think this can be tackled properly. But what happens is that the main point is that don't ignore oral history as well. The main point that everybody wants to say that don't ignore the oral history. You take the oral dimension, the dimension of the common people's ideas and memories, and take those kinds of things into consideration while writing the history of the nation. Okay, so history of the nation is incomplete without history of the people. So that is the main lesson that is wanted to be generated, I feel. But oral memory is often taken as in a group. Okay, not just one memory is presented, but the memories of people of the same generation or the same class, they are taken together. And on the basis of these materials, the historian comments. He or she has his or her own areas of doubt, and he elaborates and explains those areas as well. He or she identifies those areas, and then obviously he wants to come to a kind of a
Yeah.
Sir, I have one doubt here. Just
please.
a simple, very simple questions. And when we deal with oral history, suppose we want to collect history of a particular person or a towering personality, and while collecting the oral history from his followers, the oral history appears in a different way. And if we collect the oral history from some of his known people, or which are not his ardent follower, which I should say, the history appears to some extent a different way. In the followers' history, we find some sort of exaggeration. And in such a situation, how to judge the original one and come to a conclusion?
You are right. These are the questions that I was telling Pratyusha, because a person is not only liable to forgetfulness, but a person might also lie or may not reveal each and every detail for personal reasons. For example, there were many. Actually, Urvashi Bhuttaria actually faced similar questions, similar situations. Not all women will reveal their stories, and if there is a pressure on that woman, that particular woman, then it might be unethical as well. So what happens that is that you will have to see how that can be managed. And there may be people who might lie, and therefore the versions may differ. The versions of so-called truth may differ. I'm not sure how the historians tackle with this question, but I think they if they doubt that there is some element of misconception or amnesia in certain statements, they consult other related matters and areas. Okay, this is how they want to verify the veracity of a statement, veracity of some opinion, etc., etc. But oral historians always leave spaces for doubts and ambiguities. Okay,
Yes.
with
Yes,
those
sir.
things, historians approach.
Yes, sir.
I'm not a historian, but what I gather or what I feel, this might be the case, or whatever kind of information I have gathered, I can say this much only.
Yes, sir. You have mentioned one point, that is deliberate and forceful. So this thing also should be taken into consideration.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for sharing your valuable insights on this topic. of partition studies, and also giving us new directions of thought. Definitely, that as Dr. Ghorali has mentioned, it's really eye-opening kind of an experience, definitely. And also, thank you for giving us so many books to refer to, like the name of books, and so these are all new books that I see. So definitely, thank you so much, sir. And we are very grateful to you that you shared such important information. Uh, Thank you for joining us today, sir. And
Pleasure. Pleasure and thank you.
yes, sir. And I hope that we meet soon in person,
Uh,
not through the screen.
sure, sure.